So on the Nick Nurse front,
Yes.
I would say I was whelmed by his first season is probably
Nobody ever says that. You can be overwhelmed, you can be underwhelmed. Nobody says
I was
whelmed.
whelmed. I would lean, if anything, toward underwhelmed, but I don't feel especially strongly about that. I think we saw flashes of, okay, this is why this guy built the reputation he did prior to even getting to the head job in Toronto. And certainly when he had the title season and the season after that, which I've said on the show many times, that I think was his best coaching job, 2019-20, Kawhi leaves. They still have a lot of the pieces of that title team. And, who knows how it plays out if there's no COVID, no Disney World bubble, how everything goes. But that was a tremendous defensive team that his strengths as an adaptive coach, a tactical game-to-game type guy really shined with that team. So I think we saw less of that from him this year. If anything, and I said this on the show, I thought that he skewed more conservative and closer to his predecessor, Doc Rivers, than many people were expecting in terms of not playing the young guys as many minutes as people would like. And look, I tried to warn people coming in, Nick Nurse is a guy who's going to play the best players, play the veterans, do the things that you expect most NBA coaches to do. And while we were able to get those brief glimpses at a Ricky Council, who then eventually earned himself a contract and a spot there, it was kind of business as usual in terms of how the rotation was set. Now, there were some more play-to-play, game-to-game wrinkles. I thought there were individual matchups where we saw, okay, this is a coaching staff that is taking prep work seriously. So one of the ones that stood out for me was, do you remember the home game they had against Sacramento where Sabonis was in a really good groove coming into that game and they just completely shut him down, used Tobias as that big defender and mixed and matched some things around that. And that to me was like, oh, this is the sort of thing we might see in the playoffs. I think one of the big problems he ran into, and I think this will end up being a theme of the show for how we look at Nurse for next season, was just that the roster was never really whole throughout the year. Obviously, Joel missing all the time he did played a big part, but also the DeAnthony Melton factor, right? Like DeAnthony is a guy who helps tie a lot of lineups together, who gives you that type of versatility at the guard spot as let's say you're playing really small. You play three guards. He can guard up a little bit because he's got the big wingspan and the athleticism. So his absence, I think, played a big role in how the rotation played out and their inability to do things like throw a full court press at teams and do some of the stuff that he had success with in Toronto. So once they got to the playoffs, I thought you saw that reflected in the approach to the Knicks series, because I would say if there was anything I was disappointed in, it was how that series played out and how, I guess the biggest deal was just they couldn't win minutes without Joel on the floor, but they didn't really look for any unique answers. There was never, hey, we're going to throw Ricky or KJ or one of these guys in there. And as we said during the series, it's not to say that it would have worked, but I thought it was at least worth looking at stuff like that. So that's where I think if I was disappointed, I would point to, was that when it was actually time for him to be okay, I'm the creative X's and O's guy against Tibbs, who they run what they run, they do what they do, and we just have to find ways around that. He coached a lot more like Tibbs than I think people would have expected or hoped for.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the show, and the question was posed, like, what does Nick Nurse have to do to help the Sixers advance? And for the most part, I think it's get better players, which is why we spent the first month of this offseason talking about the players they could acquire, and then we went today, oh shoot, we really haven't talked too much about Nick Nurse yet. Let's have this show. Players matter more than the coach. The coach adapts to the players, but ultimately, if the players aren't good enough, then you're going to struggle. There are little things that I could nitpick, like after the Sixers acquired Buddy, I thought he should have played more with Joel Embiid. It seemed like Nick kind of tied Buddy to the non-Embiid minutes and had Tyrese Maxey and Kyle Lowry out there to start. And quite frankly, I thought you need Kyle Lowry on the floor more when Embiid's not there, because you need somebody then to run a little offense, maybe free Maxey to run off ball. You need Buddy on there when Joel's there. I would have liked a little bit of that reversed. I thought in the beginning of the season he empowered Paul Reed a little bit too much, and we spoke a lot about like when you simplify Paul Reed's role, you get a better version of Paul Reed. So I can nitpick that. Although quite frankly, I think losing James Harden was an even bigger factor in Paul's struggles this year. I don't think he had maybe as many answers as you expected, but I also don't think he's near the top of the list of the problems either. I did think that we saw a little bit of more like Nick Nurse in his natural state during those 2 months without Joel Embiid, when they really ramped up the defensive pressure, helped keep them competitive. I thought they defended well over those 2 months. I thought they forced turnovers. It felt like a Nick Nurse team for a little bit more. But for the most part, I think they need to get better players.
Wow, that's a controversial opinion over there, Derek.
And for me, which we talked about this more so in-house, maybe some outside just discussions about what Nick Nurse, because for me, as you talked about with the players part of it, needing those players, for a while there, I looked at it and said it was somewhat incomplete. So it's right along of that whelmed part of it, just because he didn't have DeAnthony Melton for a big part of the season. Joel went down for 29 games and missed some sporadic ones here and there. And those are 2 of your main keys to what you do with your lineup. Yeah. So it's with Embiid on the floor with Melton. Sometimes Melton's on the floor with Maxey when Joel was off the floor. And if Tobias Harris is not picking up some of the slack, you would see Melton do some different things and help out there. And that's why it's a little unfair to say incomplete, because of course you have a complete season and you do some things. But for a good portion of it, while I wasn't saying he was perfect, I was just looking at it as I would really like to evaluate him with a complete roster and see what he does with it, because the roster then got turned over at the trade deadline because you lost some of the depth that you did have with Marcus Morris, along with having Patrick Beverley, with Batum and some of the guys that came in, Robert Covington now out of the lineup. You didn't have enough there where I wanted to see those things of that tinkering that we've seen from Nick Nurse in the past. And what does he do with this particular roster to make that happen when you have a guy like Joel Embiid, who is a superstar player in this league? And so that's where I was. And I put it out front there. I was a Nick Nurse guy coming in of, hire that guy, because I think he is good enough. I saw what he did with Toronto. I want to see if he can do that same thing here. And while I saw a lot of good things, there were those times where, where's Ricky? It wasn't just because we had fun in making Ricky a part of our show. It was because of
we could see what he brought to the table.
No. There was lacking of energy. There was lacking of corralling a rebound with 2 hands. There was a lacking of snatching a rebound out of the air and even taking it from a 7-footer like Mo Bamba because he wanted it more. And that was, where are you pulling that when we've seen it work before? Yes, it was just Washington, but we also saw it in other spots too. We didn't see enough. So there were times where, of course, I pointed at Nick Nurse because there are 82 games that he's not going to do everything right. But there were plenty of good things that I saw, some bad. But I'll lean right there in between the guys of there was whelmed and there was need more players there for Nick Nurse in this season. And we have, of course, a lot to talk about of what he can do, where does he stand with the other coaches in the NBA. But that was kind of where I was of that. It's kind of incomplete